Rabindranath Maharaj won the 2011, just last year, Trillium Book Award for The Amazing Absorbing Boy, published by Knopf, Canada. Please welcome Rabindranath Maharaj.
There it is. I was looking for I misplaced my bag with my books and so on. So what I have to do is I'm going to start from the beginning. I don't have any marks on this novel. I might go on and on and on. I'd like to thank Janet and Amy and everybody else associated with the Trillium and with this event today for having me. And I'm going to read from the book that won the Trillium last year. It's The Amazing Absorbing Boy. In this book, it deals with a young Trinidadian who is moved to Canada following the death of his mother. He comes to Canada to be with his father who abandoned the family a while ago. But his father wants nothing to do with him. So this boy, 17 years old, what he has to do, he has to navigate the city, the province, the country by himself, and try to understand what Canada is or what it represents to him and what he can offer to Canada. And when I began this novel, I had in mind a more conventional immigrant novel with a sort of middle-aged person who moved to Canada with a lot of dreams and so on. These dreams weren't really realized. He was frustrated. He got some kind of self-awareness at the end. And, but while I was thinking of the novel, I realized that there's a new kind of immigrant, somebody younger, I guess more aware of his or her new country, somebody more willing to participate and try to determine where he or she might fit into this country. And this is why I chose a young person who is exactly the opposite of his father. Somebody who came to Canada with a lot of dreams. These dreams weren't realized. He became bitter. He blamed the country for his failures. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning. When my mother died 4 months after my 16th birthday, I felt like I had already received glimpses of all that would follow. Like if I was once again sitting on a dusty, silvery asteroid and could see through lanes of swirling space dust and dark, puffed-up clouds, right through the salmon tree in our front yard where the shadows of our Mayara neighbors cast a crooked picket fence on the coffin. I could even make out my uncle, Uncle Boise, still looking funny in his black suit, staring again at the road, as if in this replay, my father would suddenly appear in a puff of sulfurous smoke. But my father was not Nightcrawler, the comic book superhero, and I was not Dr. Manhattan, who could see into the future. This person has a comic book kind of background. Yet until that morning in June when a life passed through and Uncle Boise held my hand and pulled me out of the house as if it was suddenly a dangerous place, I always expected my mother to recover. I say this even though she had been sick for the last 4 months with all the wavy hair falling out, so that instead of looking prettier than all the Mayara women, she began to resemble the caged monkey inside the rum shop in the village. I held on to this fate even when she returned from the clinic in a nearby town, walking so tiredly that I had to support her into the house. When a few of the neighbors began whispering nonsense about voodoo and obeah, when we both moved in with her brother, Uncle Boise, and he began to treat me all of a sudden more kindly than he had ever done before. I think my mother was responsible for these thoughts because 3 weeks before she died, we returned to our own house on Church Street, just a quarter mile from the beach. I was relieved and felt that everything would soon get back to normal. She would stop vomiting and become stronger, and the kitchen would once more smell of shadow benny, ripe plantain, and cassava pone. And the dripping sink would sound like faraway cymbals for the high-pitched Bollywood songs she was always humming. I was convinced of her recovery when, during those 3 weeks, she began dressing up in fancy clothes I had never seen before. Each afternoon when I returned home from the Mayara Composite School, I saw her in a new and unfamiliar dress. They looked expensive, with sashes, embroidered collars, and frilly hems. She appeared paler too, though whether this was from the powder on her face or from her sickness, I could not say. Some evenings, Mulai, the village midwife, who doubled as a nurse, would be there forcing my mother to drink some nasty-smelling potion. Whenever Mulai saw me, her small eyes would get lost in the loose skin, making her look like a spiteful river turtle, a moracoid. Uncle Boise came each evening and stayed with my mother for an hour or so, except for the day that another relative, Auntie Umbrella, my father's sister, turned up. That evening, Uncle Boise took one look at my aunt and left in a hurry. My aunt had come armed with a prayer book and an old umbrella strengthened with bicycle spokes. From my bedroom, I heard her preaching about salvation and rapture in Abraham's bosom. The following day, my mother was in bad shape. And when I saw her vomiting in an enamel bowl held by Mulai, I really did not want to go to school. All day I thought of her, but in the afternoon, she was dressed up even more than the last few days. She was wearing rouge that made her cheeks look bonier, like a wrinkly lady taking a deep drag from a cigarette, and instead of the veil tied tightly around her bald head, she had on a wig with the hair plaited just like in the picture of her that used to hang above the front door. She had recently replaced this picture together with all the other happy ones she had removed over the years. She was sitting by the window as usual, and as Mulai, the midwife, was not there, I pulled up a chair from the kitchen. My mother put her hand on mine, and I looked out of the window, trying to match her view. I saw the breadfruit tree with leaves like huge moth wings, and scattered all around, sword-shaped balisay with sickly yellow flowers. In the field of balisay, there was a path that led to the main road, and I wondered whether my mother was watching and waiting for somebody to turn up. With a fancy dress and powdered face and new shoes and plaited hair wig, I got distracted by the cornbird nest swinging from the breadfruit tree. About 2 years earlier, when I was 14, my mother had spotted me with a slingshot and asked from the window if the birds had ever done anything bad to me. On my way from school the next day, I wondered whether it was the same family that had been living in the nest for all these years, or whether the baby birds had grown up and had their own children. Uncle Boise's station wagon that day was parked in the yard, and when I opened the door, I saw him and Mulai supporting my mother. "Where are you going?" I asked them. My mother was wearing a completely white dress with bows by the collar, and she smelled of some strong perfume. "Help, boy, help." Mulai sounded grumpier than usual. I held my mother's arm and supported her to the steps and into the station wagon. Just before they pulled off, Uncle Boise, as if the question I had asked had not registered, said, "To Liberty Cinema. Sylvie, your mother wants to look at a movie." "I could come?" I asked. My mother closed her eyes and leaned her head against the seat. Uncle Boise told me, "Better you stay home, boy, see the house." I asked them, "Could I come the next time then?" My mother's eyes opened weakly, and she seemed to smile a little. 3 days later, she died, and I moved back to Uncle Boise's place, alone this time. The day after the funeral, by the way, this is a funny book, it's not sad. 3 days after the funeral, Uncle Boise asked me how I was holding up. He must have seen me staring at the boys around my age in his shop, gathering fish hooks and corks from the lower shelves, and women stretching to reach some kitchen gadgets strung on nails on the wall. I told him I was okay because I didn't know what else to say, and his eyes got watery and he started to cough to hide whatever was going through his mind. I'll just read one little piece here again, where Samuel, the boy, eventually comes to Canada. And as I mentioned before, his father wants nothing to do with him. So, in the months before she died, my mother stopped talking of my father. Uncle Boise took over, and sometimes in my mother's quietness, I felt she didn't agree with my uncle's criticism, even though she once used to say some of the same things, except in a more resigned way. Her silence took me back to the time after his last disappearance from our house. I remember how she fussed about fixing this or that around the house to surprise him when he returned. My mother tried to convince me that my father was on a ship traveling from port to magical port, and he would one day return laden with gifts spilling from his pockets and stuffed inside soft, velvety boxes. She kept that up for months, even when that final disappearance lasted far longer than the others. Once I heard a neighbor telling my mother, "It's the good-looking one and them that has caused the heartache, Sylvie. Real charmers, but skeffy like hell." From my mother's little smile, I felt that they were talking of my father. He appeared that way in the pictures too, with his unbuttoned shirt and long hair and stubble on his face and his bored look. But then most of the pictures were removed, one by one, the happier ones first. And my own memories of his time with us, broken up by his trips away, faded. And I began to see him, from Uncle Boyce's description, a lazy, good-for-nothing scam. So I didn't know what to expect when I landed in Toronto airport and glanced around. There were a few men with beards and turbans, but they all seemed to be working in the building. I walked to a bench, and when a middle-aged man with a mustache sat next to me, I wondered if he was my father and kind of could make people shorter and fatter. But the man hailed out a woman in an accent like rolling marbles. After 10 minutes or so, I went outside, but the place was too cold, so I returned to the bench. Could my father have forgotten my arrival? Did Uncle Boyce's letter somehow get lost? This was worse than getting stranded in Trinidad, in some small town in Trinidad, with no money for passage. Then I remembered that my uncle had given me $500 and I had a 6-month visa. By then, most of the people from the flight had left with their families, so I dragged my suitcase once more outside. "Your name is Sam?" It was a man leaning against the wall and smoking. He looked a little like Lee Van Cleef from the West End, sort of grim and calculating. But then I saw the person from the pictures in our living room. I told him yes and followed him to a bus a little distance away. I hauled my suitcase up the steps and we sat on the opposite seat. While we were waiting for the driver, I expected that my father would ask about the trip or what Mayaro or about my dead mother, but he just gazed outside. Maybe he was feeling shy, just like me, rehearsing what to say because we had not seen each other since I was 6, which was 11 years ago. Then the driver, who was well-dressed for a bus driver, came in and we took off. I remember how the Trinidad driver, always stopped midway for a drink of rum, not caring about the passengers cursing and bawling at him through the windows. "Bring your ass here, man. It's the government property, not your bus you're driving." Not your mother's bus you're driving. But this driver announced our stops on a mic, like if he was a pilot, Dundas Harbour Castle, Royal York. Everywhere looked neat and organized with lanes and parks bordered by wavy concrete banks. The trees, which didn't have any leaves, were planted in a straight line. People with coats were walking briskly, not chatting in groups like in Trinidad. They all looked faded, like dematerializing comic book ghosts. This was so exciting, I could almost believe one of my old school friends, Pantamuli, friend of flavored ice falling from the sky. I wish my school friends could be with me now to see all the tall buildings and highways with so many lanes. I glanced at my father. In the evening, he looked pale and sad, like someone sitting in a damp, dark place, like the Batcave, and knowing his skeins were slipping away, one by one. When the bus dropped us off at Union, we took a tram car, which was like a train running on the streets. It was colder than the bus, and my father must have seen me shivering because he asked me, "You know what season this is, boy?" "March," I told him. I see. March is a season now. Nice, very nice. It sounded like a Mayari joke, but he didn't laugh. Maybe I should stop here. Penis.